for research in sensing, so you're at one of our events. We're an interdisciplinary research institute at UC that's focused on sensing and perception and sensor technology development. We do quite a few things, one of which is a graduate training program. We've got some of our graduate fellows here, and one of the faculty members involved in our graduate program. We run these public-facing events. They are called alloys. I'll tell you just a quick thing about that to orient you in just a minute here. We also have an annual working group that's going to be in 2 weekends. This year it's about light and its effects on human health and its role in architecture, etc. We also have an annual festival and conference on sensing and perception called IRiS Ignite. That's May 17th and 18th on UC campus. We're really cool. Art, performance, music, alongside like hardcore engineering and biology of sensing and psychology of perception, etc. So we've got great keynote speakers. If you're not on our mailing list already, I feel like a lot of you are on our mailing list. If you're not, you can talk to Nishay or me later, and we can get you signed up for that. I'll keep you in the know. The alloys are interdisciplinary conversations that we have. We like to think of them as a meeting of minds and curious conversation. I think most of you have been to one of these before, but the idea is that we invite 6 people to talk with each other, but they're really the seed crystal for a much larger conversation that's meant to involve the audience. So they don't tend to be very prepared. I know that Chris and Pietro both have kind of got a couple of questions to get the conversation moving, but then it's meant to move from outward from that into these concentric circles. So raise your hand if you want to ask something or make a comment or you're curious about something. So Chris and Pietro will be helping to bring those audience insights in. Nishay is here streaming us live through Restream. That puts us out on YouTube and Twitter, and our audiences there can engage with us digitally, so they can write in questions. So Nishay may wave her hand around in case somebody in our virtual audience wants to say something. But yeah, these are not meant to be panels. These are meant to be conversations. So please join us in that spirit. Do I have anything else I need to share? I think that's about it. Yeah. So I think at this point, I'm just going to hand it over to Chris and Pietro, who are going to introduce the topic of conversation and those that they've invited to really help us with that. So,
yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Sorry.
Sure. So my name is Christopher Platz. I'm an assistant professor of art history and museum studies at the University of Cincinnati. And I focus on the Middle Ages and the early modern period. And my co-moderator tonight, Pietro Strobia, I'm happy to say that I collaborate with him and I work with him to think about the technical study of art using certain kinds of scientific instrumentation to analyze paintings and illuminated manuscripts and things like that. We'll hopefully learn a little bit about that tonight. But when we were thinking about bringing together the 6 speakers that we have and starting this conversation, we wanted to think about sensing and think about the arts and think about the senses themselves and their connections from different points of view. And to draw in artists and curators, art conservators, historians, scientists, chemists in particular, and get different points of view, different ideas about research practice, about teaching, about curatorial and conservation practice, about artistic practice. So we have these voices here tonight, and we are excited to think about the ways broadly conceived that art and sensing intersect or overlap, how they might manifest themselves in our own work, our own practices. So I will let my co-moderator, Pietro Strobia, introduce himself and continue.
Yeah, so welcome everyone, and thank you for being here. And yes, as Chris said, this is an occasion to mix, like when we collaborate, the idea is to mix art and science, and then we brought in other voices that can like talk about how that what is done in the museum and on an artist perspective. But I'm gonna start introducing myself and then some of the speakers tonight, and then you can go ahead and do the rest. So yeah, you have my bio here. So no, I'm Pietro Strobia, and I'm assistant professor in chemistry at the University of Cincinnati. And in my lab, we are a sensing lab, but we do that, we mean that in a, I guess, different way that we're going to talk about tonight, because we make biosensors. But in our lab, we also use Raman spectroscopy, which is a scattering technique, which means that all we do is we shine a very strong source of light on a sample, and then we get the scattering spectrum. This is a very non-invasive process, because light, unless you really push it, light doesn't really burn things. So it's very good for artifacts, but you get a very high grade of information from this technique, and is especially good in detecting different type of pigments. And I think Lindsay will maybe discuss a little bit of that. And so when I started my lab, I do want to do chemistry, but I also want to do something like more, they could be more, I guess, moving away from the normal field of chemistry or the type of work that we do, and also trying to be like the idea of outreach. So doing something like outside of like just something that benefit the lab, but like try to like benefit like museums or other artists in the area. So we started to do some Raman for connecting to art, and I work with Chris a little bit on that. And in the future, we also want to start teaching some of that as well at University of Cincinnati. And here with me is also Dr. Lindsay Kissel. She works in my lab. So yeah, she's a postdoctoral researcher at University of Cincinnati in the chemistry department. Before coming to my lab, she was a PhD student at Portland State University. And before that, she was at Louisville. She did a bachelor in chemistry as well. She's here because like in my lab, we do a little bit of Raman for art, heritage science. But in her PhD, she was working on collecting microscopic ink samples on works of art on paper. So she was studying the ink that were used in 18th century Japanese woodblock prints. And so she has a lot of experience in working with museums and doing chemistry for heritage science. And with us is also the chief conservator at the Cincinnati Art Museum, which is Serena, that she joined us tonight. And which before being the chief conservator at CAM, she was a conservator in paintings at the Detroit Institute of Art. And before that, she got her master. She got a bachelor in art history at Tufts University and a master at NYU. And she actually recently, they were in the news, both Serena and Peter, which you're going to introduce. They were in the news because they discovered a portrait beneath Cézanne still life. So they were able to see something beyond the painting, and that's definitely a question that the audience should ask and fill in. And yes, but those are two of the panelists that are going to be here with us. And
Yeah.
Chris is going to introduce.
And I'll introduce the other two panelists. So sitting across from me, Dr. Peter Jonathan Bell. He's the curator of European painting, sculpture, and drawings at the Cincinnati Art Museum. He's been there since 2017, and his degrees are from Oberlin College, the Courtauld Institute of Art, and the New York University's Institute of Fine Arts. He's widely lectured and published in North America and Europe on Renaissance and Baroque art history. And before Cincinnati, Peter was a curator in the Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. And at CAM, he's mounted exhibitions of painting, sculpture, and decorative arts from the Renaissance period all the way to the 19th and now 20th century. He's spearheaded many acquisitions, and currently he is working on a Picasso exhibition opening in June. And Peter I know all the way back from early graduate school days, and I've had the good fortune to see him in Rome itself when he was a fellow at the American Academy. And it's always a pleasure to invite him to my courses and get his take on exhibitions, on art and science, on many different things. And he has a lot of interesting insights on thinking about art in the senses in the 15th century, the 16th century, how objects themselves give us clues today about how they were sensed, how they were perceived in that period. Ideas that we can apply to works of art of all sorts and presentations of artworks in museums. And then sitting to my right is Supramarin Agarwal, And Supermarin's an Indian artist working at the intersections of architecture, sculpture, and landscape. She's presently engaged in Field, a collaborative arts project that considers the cultivated lawns in contemporary cities to explore how our conceptions of nature are shaped by colonial narratives. Her work's been exhibited internationally, including at the Venice Biennale for Architecture in 2021, the Untitled Art Fair, Headlands Center for the Arts, Governor's Island, Tactile Bosch, Wales, the India Habitat Center, and others. She's the recipient of a Franklin Furnace Fund for Performance Art, the NYFA Immigrant Artist Fellowship, and a finalist for the Creative Capital Award. Supermarin is an assistant professor at the School of Art, and she has an MFA degree from the San Francisco Art Institute in California. So we have the six of us here, and so I'm just going to start off with kind of an open-ended question, and following that, we are excited to take questions and comments and thoughts from everybody in the audience. But I'm just going to start with one, and this is to everyone. So the question I'd like to ask and have you guys think about is, in your own work, whether it's artistic or conservation, curatorial, scientific work, how do you think about art and sensing, or art and the senses, broadly conceived? Where are the overlaps? Where are the intersections? And how might they be manifest explicitly or implicitly in your practices? So in artistic practice or in conservation practice, curatorial work or scientific work, where are those intersections, and how do you see them?
Okay, I'm gonna start.
And you should start.
With another question.
You can lead us off.
Yeah, but so I think about this a lot, and so actually I think there is overlapping, of course, but I think there is a big separation between the two things, because so my point is this, and I'm not making it super clear because I didn't prepare it, but so the idea is this: so with science we can sense something, and we can identify all the tiniest variables that make a certain paintings. Now, if I have all the variables that make that painting, say if I know this pigment went there, this pigment went there, this pigment went there, can I really replicate that painting, or is there something else in art that I guess transcend like itself, the object, and like give you a little more to it? And what is that additional things? Because I don't know, my thought about this is usually when I go see art is usually if I have the context, that probably gives me a lot more about that art piece. But I think there is something even more than that, like, because like even like if someone that doesn't know anything about art go to a museum and sees like Monet nymphes, I don't know, it's in English,
lilies.
yeah, or lilies, yeah. If you see the lilies, like, is gonna experience something unique, and so I think we can sense art with science, but I think there is something that we cannot do, otherwise it will not be art. But it's still useful science. But, yeah. But I think it's interesting to say. Yeah, I don't know. What do you guys think on your side?
I think piggybacking off of the idea of like putting together the variables, though, and in the experiences that I've had, we often now seeing pieces that are very old, right? We may see something that we perceive as one way, but when we do that analysis and we put together those variables, we might find that something has changed over time. And so the way that the current population is taking in that art and the way that they're perceiving it is different than maybe the way it was perceived when it was originally made, because of fading of colors or shifting of colors. So I think that is also something that's interesting to think about, is that we're not experiencing what was experienced when a piece was commissioned or made in the past.
So does that go back to the idea that art piece is art because of the context, or?
Yeah, I think,
Because we have the context, yeah.
Right, and the context changes the way that we perceive it. So the variables that you're talking about putting together do give us a different context than you would get in a museum, but it still changes the way that you perceive the object.
I think there's another change you have to think about too, is that illiteracy. A lot of the things I've worked on were made to communicate to people who couldn't read. And so they would have a purely instinctive reaction to, usually I'm talking about Christian art. And I just always remember a big project I worked on was assembling, or theoretically reassembling a big altarpiece that had been cut up, and it was scenes from the life of a saint. And the pieces were all over the world in different collections. And when it came down to putting them together, you can do things like matching wood grain, matching nails, matching trims. And your instinct is to put it together, reading from right to left, top to bottom. But in fact, people don't read. So generally what it was from the outside in, so that at the end of the story of the saint's life, you would be focusing on the scene in the middle, which was usually, a crucifixion or a Madonna or something. So that was a kind of an eye opener for me, to really take a step back and think about your audience.
One of the things that I do in my teaching and in my research is I try to take advantage of museums like the Cincinnati Art Museum and some of the displays. And so in one of the medieval and Renaissance galleries, there is a very large Spanish altarpiece. And the way it's displayed is such that it's on a pedestal that is about the height of what a Christian altar would be in a church. So when I take students in this space, even though we can't ever fully reconstruct an original context for a work of art that's 700, 600 years old, it's still valuable, I think, to imagine the different senses that would be engaged in the original environment. So not only does the display itself, putting the altarpiece at about the height at which it would have been seen in a church, not only is that helpful, but to actually think about the lighting conditions and to think about the other senses, physical senses that would have been activated, in this case, in a Christian setting. So thinking about the incense you might smell, or the chanting that you could hear, or the type of light that would have been admitted by the windows in the church, or the candlelight on the altar. So even though it's a very kind of straightforward idea of art in the senses, the idea of imagining and trying to think about what it would have been like to see an artwork, but also to have your other senses activated by the overall environment, or to immerse yourself, is a helpful thing to do. And some museums and some exhibitions sometimes go further than others in offering a reconstruction of that original environment. But it's one of those interesting, I think, debates in the museum field. How immersive do you want to get? Perhaps you guys have seen these advertisements or seen the immersive Van Gogh exhibitions, for instance.
Which you don't like, clearly.
I haven't been there. That's another topic. But I just wanted to say that it is a pleasure to bring my students to the Cincinnati Art Museum and to think about some of the display strategies that perhaps Peter's put into play, or his colleagues. And Serena, how you've thought about some of these works, or even brought them back and made them what they are today for us to use as a touch point for thinking about artworks back in time.
I'm not going to comment on the immersive Van Gogh show.
I mean, maybe coming from like a kind of an oppositional perspective. Recently, I had a piece that was in a gallery in Chelsea that was removed because it smelled.
Sensory.
And that wasn't acceptable.
And that was not acceptable.
It smelled
Was
bad.
that on purpose?
Yeah. I collaborate, and I've been collaborating on this pretty durational project. And so I use waste lawn clippings, and I've developed a new biomaterial, bioplastic from your yard waste, basically. And I'm interested in like the aesthetics of nature and the colonization of nature and the homogenization of like nature in cities. So a lot of the work is about that sense of repugnance and pleasure and horror of nature. So it's really interesting thinking about like where the senses are romanticized and where they're real. Like the sense of smell is something that transcends sight, that moves through a space, that invades a space. And I mean, I didn't intend for the gallery to be so upset with it. And I think the smell is really nice, but it's also such a cultural thing, right? Like in India, we have a tradition of henna, which is like this green pasty thing you put on your hands, and like the city is sensorial. The things are allowed to smell in different ways. So I'm interested in how museum and gallery spaces often lead a very precarious balance in that context. And I know, I mean, especially these days with a lot of the bioart shows and exhibitions that are on, for example, at the MIT List recently, there was a show, and they're tackling with a lot of these issues of how do you conserve these kinds of works? How do you like manage things that grow?
The Biennale is only 2 years.
I have a question. So when the piece was put into the gallery, were they aware that it was going to smell in advance? Or was it just like not something you thought to mention? Or like, I don't know.
So
like,
the curator who like curated me in the show knew and knows my work really well. But the gallery owner did not.
Okay.
So it was curated in, but then like there was this freak out because people were like just the idea that an artwork can smell means that maybe it's toxic.
Yeah, so I was gonna say
that like something is wrong. So it was very, very complicated. And
Yeah.
we've been sort of negotiating this through some unpleasant emails back and
I don't know if Serena has this kind of gut reaction, but I feel like conservators that I've met, if they smell something in a gallery, immediately your gut reaction is like, where is it coming from? Is it hurting anything? So like that's what I thought of when you said that. It's like what other pieces were in the gallery, like if they weren't aware it was coming from the art itself, but they thought it was, you know, one of the materials that was used to put the piece in, to install the piece. Like where is it coming from? What can we do about it?
So complicated.
Yeah.
It's so complicated.
Did it progress, or was it initially it was smelled what it smelled like, or
It was the same. It's.
or it got stronger?
I mean,
or?
you've seen, you've smelled my work, Mark.
Very interesting encounter. But I'm reminded of all the years I spent in New York in the 80s and 90s. In relation to sense, the withdrawal of the senses from engagement with work was so pressing, and to the extent where really it was really a cerebral engagement above all, in the discussion of concepts and ideas. To the extent where if you did go to an opening, which was extremely rare, and there was food and wine served, it felt wrong. So you could smell it as you came up the stair, and that really cut through any possibility of engagement with the work. So I think that smelling your work instead of food would be a relief, of course, but it's still be disconcerting, I'm sure, for many people.
When this is great, this is so great. No, I mean, don't you think? No, but when I thought about that, your very open-ended question, Chris and Pietro, my instinct. Well, first of all, I was thinking like, experiential sensing within a gallery, and how much light to put on an object. How when I walk through the Dutch gallery at the museum, it's always freezing cold, and what does that do to how I interact with the art? But then where my sort of research mind goes is back to, the Renaissance and who they're looking at, and, Aristotelian, philosophy of perception, and it all connects back because, from that early moment, there's a hierarchy of senses, right? And Aristotle connects vision to the intellect. and senses like taste and touch and smell are they're at the same time they're both they're more vulgar, they're less they're less lofty, but they're also more primary. So like they give us, according to Aristotle, they give us more information. Touch, and the work that Chris was referencing before has to do with small scale sculpture and how interacting with sculpture with your hands. But it all so a lot of that thought is that the touch gives you more information, but it's not what we should be striving for. And smell gives you more information, but we need to be sort of doing the New York scene thing and reading it all with our brains and our eyes.
I'd ask you both if you thought it might be different for the artists of the Renaissance, because a book I love is Kroger's Diary from the 16th century Mannerist painter, where for all our reading into the work about expression and chaos, psychic chaos, all he talks about are the meat of meals he's having, and when he refers to his work at all, it's sort of a little drawing saying, "I painted the leg today." And so I wondered whether there was any evidence of Renaissance artists focused on, contra Aristotle, focusing on other senses in relation to priorities.
I would think definitely that they were thinking, the artists at that time, like many artists today, were thinking holistically with their whole bodies. Who is it? Cellini, the great Medici artist, sculptor, bronze caster. He, parts of how they're making art, like he says, get down on the floor when you're casting bronze. They'd have the mold in, they dig a big pit in the floor of the studio and put the mold in there and cover it with, so it doesn't burn down the city, and then pour the molten bronze in. And he'd say, you wait until you hear it thumping, and then it's time to, so there's this this, and it made me also think about that of course all of this art that Serena, that we're talking about, that Chris studies, was made to be in this rich context that you're referring to of sights and smells and touches. And then here we are, museums, part of our big job is to sort of denature that older, and galleries to denature that, while at the same time trying to educate about it. It's really it's a challenge.
I mean, it's so interesting because it is sort of like the relationship between like where the work is produced and where the work resides, right? Like the function of the studio kind of texts, and like what is this sort of usually dingy, dirty, smelly basement space where all of these works are being produced by usually not very wealthy people, and where they go to land or live or die. It's so interesting. I mean, it is also like was beautifully put, I think, about the visual sense being the one that's sort of like more invisible or private, and that there seems to me some relationship between like the sort of individuation of like you go to the space, and even if you go together, you experience the work alone, and that sense of like, I think, therefore I'm separate, we are separate, versus in other cultures or other ways of being where like the work is meant to be experienced together, so the smell is shared and the work is shared.
So on the technical side, if you want to talk about like smell, taste versus sight. So technically, if you think about it, like how chemistry works, like sight is a much less advanced sensor than would you think for like smell.
Really?
Instead. Yeah, because like so for the smell, you need like a protein that has to shape perfectly in a certain way to like catch a certain chemical and once it catches, it like give a signal and that goes in. Like sight is purely in your brain. It's like I consider it like high quality data versus high quantity data. Like right now, our world is going towards high quantity data, which means like you take a picture with your phone, AI will tell you everything about what's going on in that picture. But what I do in my lab is sensors, which like catch a very specific molecule and quantify that very specific molecule, which is more similar, like a biosensor is more similar to your nose or your tongue. Like the sight is all AI, like the equivalent of AI on a computer. You see an image, you have seen so many images, and now you can connect that image to something. But at the end, we are really like have like a few sensors in our eye that can catch like different wavelengths, but that's it. It's not that intricate.
It's also like sight is the only sense where there's really no material interaction, right? It's the only sense that's just picking up energy, scattered photons, whereas every other sense is like, like sound is kinetic movement of air hitting our eardrums and also our bodies. Taste is obviously, it's if you're tasting it, it's in your body. Smell is molecules of matter, being picked up on by receptors in the nose. Sight is really the most disconnected. Every other sense is like something is on you or engaging with your physicality in some very visceral way.
I think what's very interesting in this context is also that sight is one of the senses that we can voluntarily shut down, right? So like when we have something like a smell or an auditory experience, you can't escape it. You have to experience it. So it's kind of like this in your face. You have like if you enter the room, this is it, right? You're part of this. Or you can still choose to look away from something that doesn't, I don't know, fit your moral code or.
Maybe this changes the topic a little bit, but I go to a lot of museums, and I always wonder that we look at these 400, 500-year-old paintings. In fact, in some cases, 1,000-year-old paintings, and these were meant to be seen in a very different kind of light, right? I mean, the museum, the galleries have electric light, even though it's low, but still it's totally different kind of light, and I wonder what that has done to our perception of what we consider beautiful and what was considered beautiful then.
Can I add something to that before we get into it? Yeah, and this is, I guess, dovetailing on what you were saying before. The perception of something, it's not just the perception of something changes because, the lighting is different now than it was, say, 500 years ago. It's also the role of the work has changed so dramatically. A friend of mine wrote a book called The Nature of New York. And one of the things he talked about was sort of the development of sort of the portrait of the scene in New York, sort of playing the role of sort of for people who couldn't travel back in the 19th century, and prior to the invention of cameras or photography, there were no photographs or anything, and so that painting showing the landscape was really providing all the information anybody would ever get, about what a vista looked like in the Catskill Mountains or something like that. Going all the way back to cave drawings. We may look at those now with fascination, but at the time, they were playing a rather different role for the people who were drawing them and the people who were viewing them when they were drawn. And so I find myself wondering about just how, even in an evolutionary context, how we evolve in the context of art and how it impacts our evolution as well.
I mean, to pick up on that, visual art, at least in the West, like in that period, was a very primary method of like sensing the world for the reason we talked about. Now we have a million other methods for like visually sensing, distributing images of the world. Like we don't lack for that, but yeah, I mean, it's very difficult, I think, to imagine seeing any kind of visually representative artwork even a few hundred years ago when images or visual representation of any kind was incredibly scarce. Now we live in like the sea of images, like every moment we're bombarded with them. So to try to like recover a mindset of to see a painting in a church or anywhere as this actually like fairly rare occurrence for most people, it's just, I think it's very difficult to wrap one's head around.
Okay.
But I think it speaks to the power of the art, though, that we still find it beautiful and enjoy it, like, regardless of the fact that
Oh,
the,
yeah, it's
yeah,
not
no,
to
I'm not-
diminish its like
yeah, no, I'm
importance or
not,
anything,
I'm
it's
just saying it
different.
just has changed. It hasn't, we haven't lost anything necessarily.
But it's a different kind of.
Yeah, it's different.
Back then it was.
I mean, I'm glad that I know how to read,
But I wonder in this context if there isn't, I'm thinking about this a lot recently about, integrating art and science. And I wonder if the art is not providing something that transcends this just, obviously it has always done, right? But that transcends this like broken down just perception of what we do and what we can see or not see, hear or not hear, or smell or not smell. It has something additional, right? It has something, I don't know how to grasp it. You're better at describing it probably than me.
I mean, at the risk of sounding like a blasphemous scientist, I mean, art is certainly greater than the sum of its parts, right? It
Right,
is
and
what
it's
it is
still-
because of the parts coming together. So,
Right, but what I was,
yeah.
sorry, I totally did not make the point that I wanted to make. But so thinking about this as something that is still providing more information than just the depiction of what we see, right? It's not, I don't think that, or I wonder if it's not any different from 600 years ago where we had some additional information because we couldn't travel to spaces or we couldn't do things. And now it's potentially more, I don't know, showing us something that we otherwise couldn't describe in words, or a controversy that we don't have semantics for yet, or that we don't.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's it.
And also, we have to remember that the depiction of place was actually not the dominant kind of art at that time. If you look back at the art of the Renaissance or before that, and even in other traditions, the Indian tradition, the Persian tradition, and so on, they were not that interested in depicting place. They were interested in depicting people, and a lot of imaginary stuff. I mean, obviously a lot of it was religious, but it was totally imaginary. No one was seeing angels, but they were painting them. And then, of course, there's people like Bosch and Bruegel and painting totally imaginary things. And so I think the function of art is something that convey an image of a location is a much more, when would you say it starts in Western art, with Poussin or Claude, or even they were painting imaginary stuff mostly.
Isn't it impressionism? No.
Well, no, I mean, I would say that the landscape as a genre originates at, in the early 1500s with Titian, but that's not even the literal description of place, sort of the stand-in for visual perception.
I mean, it's not like Constable painting an actual scene and you think that this is exactly what it looked like.
Right.
I mean, there's two things that I wanted to bring up. One is so I don't know if any of you have seen, I think it was in 2017, they did the first exhibition titled Garden and Cosmos, which was a series of Indian miniature paintings that were actually really large scale. So they were the largest miniature style paintings that were sort of discovered pretty recently in the 90s or something in the palace drawer, rolled away. And it was just there's some of them, I've seen the originals. They're from Jodhpur, which is in a region in North India, and they're just exquisite, and something about them has, I mean, of course, we're talking anti-perspective or non-perspective, and they're really thinking about this relationship with landscape, which is simultaneously interior and exterior. And so, I mean, I think a lot about this in relation to my own work, but like the timmingled temporality of landscape, if anybody is like into that jam. But how these paintings, by breaking the need for perspective, were storytelling both from like the plan view and the elevation view simultaneously, to be situated so I'm not separate from the landscape, and at the same time I'm not all that there is. And I think something about this idea of like sensing and what art can do by being within and without simultaneously is like really interesting and powerful.
I think that's like a super important point. Like I would like, from my perspective, I feel like there's this tendency to like kind of set up science on one side and like artistic endeavors on the other. To me, they're more of a continuum. They're both forms of knowledge production, right? So art, taken in its broadest sense as this vast arena of human activity, is a form of sensing. It is a way of sensing things that maybe don't yield to methodologies of sensing that lie in the space of science, but they're completely entangled. For one thing, the production of art, every artist relies on methodologies and tools that have been derived by the methodologies of science. Your work is a great example. I mean, you worked with a biochemist.
Sure.
Even when artists are working with traditional media like paint, they're still relying on tests and experiments to figure out, like, how does this pigment interact? So there's like all kinds of sensing embedded in that. But the larger project of expressivity and like a reinterpretation of the world is just another form of another system of sensing.
I mean, this is like when I'm teaching, it's like such a big part of that, because there's like, it's sort of weird that what do artists do with materials, right? Like there's this stuff here in front of us and like it's wood and I don't understand it and I don't get it, or I'm not good at using it. And how do I like build a relationship with this like dead thing that's so just static unless I activate it? And I think that like what you were maybe speaking to is we often talk about this as like the object is performative. All artworks are performing. It's not about making interactive art or not, right? And there's some kind of like energy and thrust and body and ritual that you're like thrusting through your body into these like dead things that enable them to vibrate and perform somehow. So then you can die, but this thing is continuing to vibrate. And I think that that's one of the most exciting parts for me about teaching, is like, how do we make things vibrate?
So teaching people to look at art is actually giving them a new sensory perception, a new tool for sensory perception. I like that.
But creating art is always a sensory experience anyway. Even if you're just painting, the feel of the brush and the paint on the canvas, and just and its relationship with how it's going to look. And of course, if it's sculpture or something, it's even more so.
But of course, we talk about, we can never separate ourselves from these fascinating discussions about the sensory experience of making a work or encountering a work. But I'm sure if we try, just as we try to reach agreement over how people felt about an altarpiece in the Renaissance, there must have been innumerable different opinions and reactions that people would have said, the light is terrible in here, I can't see a thing, or why haven't they lit the candles? So I think that we tend to coalesce opinions around some common agreement so that we can teach effectively or make an argument in a museum, when in fact we should probably be countenancing, well, there are people who respond adversely to the style of your work, and there are others who enjoy it. And so what happens in the gallery is probably a little different from what happened in a medieval church. But I'm really fascinated by this, I don't know the terminology, but this cellular examination of the work. Because in discourses that I've had, in teaching discourses around contemporary art, one always tries to get to some kind of, or one tends to try to get to some kind of essential basis where we say, let's forget about questions of identity, let's forget about the narrative, let's forget about the biography, let's try to discuss what these materials are and what these forms are so that we can achieve some common basis for discussion that we can share. And so I would find it immensely relieving to be able to say, look, we're only going to be talking about this painting on a molecular level. We cannot bring any other information to this.
The ultimate formalism.
Exactly. And I was thinking of someone like Robert Smith's and Turing, the wanting to say if it was Smithson, I'm getting it right, the piles of dirt and gravel that are outside. We can only perceive this as non-signifying building material. So I'm very interested to hear more about, what else happens when you encounter that molecule. Do you find yourself being pulled back to senses of amazement or
I don't know. I think my perspective is like we're pretty stereo about it because like usually the questions come from the curators or conservators that have all the context, and we usually solve like a small piece of the puzzle.
That's
It
what
is
I
an
was going
important
to say,
piece,
that
but it usually
when
like
he's-
very small.
When he's identified a molecule, he has identified the molecule, but there are millions of molecules in that painting. And so you can't necessarily say that all the molecules are going to be like this. So you have to get a larger context whenever you get any kind of analytical information.
And then I think it usually often means nothing unless there was an hypothesis that you can prove or disprove. For example, like what Lindsay was working, and I think at the Met also, I know they work on this. Like there are some pigments. I cannot say dye. I have to say pigments that move from like the America to Europe, or some pigments that are only used by if the person that wanted the piece of art was very rich, like they were used, and you can identify those. In that case, you identify that and you give a piece of information to the curator. If like you find the pigment, it means like just the pigment is there, but usually doesn't give you more information. So it's always like has to be a collaboration.
You need to know, for example, that what you're testing is part of the original work. Because historically, lots of materials have been added to works of art over time.
Well,
And you can tell, we cannot.
Yeah.
It also sometimes, like in the case of the work that I've done, we answer the question, what was this molecule? And then it opens a bigger question, because now when the work that I did in my dissertation was the second study to find this one particular molecule in this one type of artwork that has no written history of that molecule being used in that type of artwork. And so now there are two museums on two different coasts saying, okay, we both have evidence of this. We don't know, the provenance or like how this colorant came to be used during this time, even though the works we were looking at were largely commercial. They were commercially made prints that were distributed widely throughout Japan. So it opens up more questions sometimes too of, where did this come from, or why was it used, but no one talked about it. So
To like paddle for like science is a very cool project that is actually my collaborator is working on. And without what they do, which is especially offset Raman, it would not be possible. So at the British Museum of Art, now they have letters that were sent probably to the Queen, or in that context, they were never open, and they cannot be open for some British reason. And, I don't know, they cannot open that. And now like they have this microscope that can look at, it's not just a simple microscope. You get scattering light, and you can look at different depth, and you can identify what molecules are there. So I don't know how many folding there are, but like they can map and see where ink and where paper is, and they can they're reconstructing what they're saying, and they're discovering now what they're saying through science. So that was already a piece of art, but now they actually give more context to the piece of art. Hopefully it's something important that they wrote in this letter.
I think you were trying.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
sorry.
I'm wondering if in these chemical or spectroscopic investigations, if you ever stumble across things that tell you a bit more about the situation that the artist was in, like non-pigments, things that get incorporated into the art that tell you something about, because I'm actually really compelled by this really sharp divide between the sensory experience of the artist making the art and how it becomes kind of divorced from that. Everything dries. It doesn't have the smells of the paints, et cetera. And it becomes this inert object that goes oftentimes into museums. And so I'm compelled by like wondering if you can get a glimpse chemically into what was going on during the creative process outside of what was intended. You know, do you get like nicotine if they were a smoker? Do you get like stuff from the food that they were using? Or do you get something about the water that was used? Or
To do that, you have to, that would take destructive testing in a lot of cases.
Okay.
And we tend not to want to do that.
Yeah.
You know, no.
And even you have to like,
Just
be
the
looking
ramen
Yeah.
for
stuff.
that.
The ramen-
Does that allow you a broader scope of mangas, or you really need to be very specific about
Ramen is mostly bulk, so
When
yeah.
when you were just talking about this, I flashed on several paintings I've worked on where I found lots and lots of hair from artists, like Utrillo, for example, and Soutine, and Augustus John. In fact, Augustus John, I worked on a mural that was 23 feet long. It was a painting, but it was a lot of time to work on it. And I found lots and lots of his hair. And I finally went to the curator and I said, did he have like chestnut brown, 8-inch? She said, yeah. It was his hair. And it was very thinly painted. It isn't like it was mixed up in there. So,
just a hairy painter?
yeah. And someone like Utrillo was a lot kind of messier than you might think. I mean, when I worked at the Barnes collection, so I had a chance to look at lots of paintings by one artist. So I looked at a lot of Modigliani's. And Modigliani, if you're familiar with him, he looks kind of a little bit random and a little bit sketchy. When you get up close to them, they're very well thought out and particular and planned, and some of them are really beautiful. They're almost like texture that he made on purpose. Where someone like Utrillo was just like all over the place with stuff in them and dried paint, dried up in the brushworks. And as a conservator, as a paintings conservator, because you spend so much time in front of a painting that you're working on, you have time to make these observations. Mm-hmm. So when I have an observation like that, it is visual, but it's also touch in a lot of cases because I am physically touching the objects. I usually do make a note in writing in the file on the painting. A lot of times I have no idea what this is about, but it's something I noticed, I'm going to write it down. And in the future, maybe someone will figure out what I saw. So
do you feel like you come to an understanding of like different sides of the personality of painters than one might gather from the art because of your close inspection?
In as much as
the process and the way
in as much as their working practice tells me something about their personality. Yeah.
I was going to say, I've also seen cases where like relatively recent artists, 20th century artists, who decided, even though, materials are widely available now, you can just go buy paints, decided, I'm going to make my own. Mm-hmm. And they have, materials that or paintings that are, listed as a tempera, for example. And then we look at it a little more closely and we do a little bit of analysis and realize like, oh, maybe this actually isn't a tempera. Maybe this is, some other, like a resin or an acrylic. And so understanding like how someone chose to make their own materials and then put those materials on canvas or on board in such a way that it kind of tricks the eye even of experts is interesting too. And like thinking about like, what was going through his mind while he was putting together this piece. So.
Nate, your question, and Serena, your comments about Utrillo make me think of a painting I always go visit in Washington, D.C., where I'm from. At the National Gallery, there's a Jackson Pollock painting. And if you look at it from the side, and so that the light rakes across the surface, and you get a sense of its texture even more than you do in front of it, you can see a giant cockroach that was unfortunately crawling across the canvas. So if you've seen those famous photographs of Jackson Pollock, he would put his canvases on the ground and drip and splatter, but there's a cockroach that you can see. And so it gives you a sense of his working conditions, maybe what it was like. And I don't doubt that if you looked really hard and spent a lot of time with his other works, you'd probably find cigarette butts or other things like that. But I always go look at this wonderful, famous painting, Lavender Mist, and if you look at it from one side, you can see like the little antennae, and so it gives you a sense. But
It didn't need advanced spectroscopy to find it.
No.
There was at the Nelson Atkins Museum 4 or 5 years ago, there was a bug they found in a Van Gogh.
Got
And that hit that hit the news pretty big. And
Oh, I
the
missed
poor
that.
conservator is just kind of fed up with this is going to be her.
Oh,
It's going to be in her obituary.
but that does tell you that Van Gogh was sitting out there in the field painting this
Yep.
landscape. He wasn't back in the studio, unless he had a bunch of grasshoppers in the studio. But, so it gives you information.
So going back to the
what you
no,
said,
go Jack.
I wonder if artists today can utilize what scientists are doing to kind of preserve their work. Like if you did headspace analysis to determine like what volatile organic compounds made your work smell the way that it did, then you could, bottle that up into a perfume or something so that hundreds of years from now, if you wanted the people viewing your work to have the whole sensory experience, you could have that there for them to spray on a little piece of paper and smell while they're viewing your work. It's not just something that we can put, to the test of artworks of the past, but the present too, to preserve it for the future.
That's cool.
Let's do it.
But yeah, in the department we can do it. Yeah.
It reminds me of something I saw today. So the College of Engineering had its expo for senior projects today in the Duke Energy Center. And one of the projects there was a virtual reality thing where you would wear your goggles and you would have the scene in front of you and there'd be objects there, and you could reach out for an object and bring it up to your nose, and then you would smell that object.
Yeah.
So it was a rose or something. So they had the aromas already built into the hand that you would bring up, and it would release the right aroma. So that's a little bit of the metaverse coming into our life.
Yeah. Well, you all mentioned the immersive experiences, those which will not be named. But I actually heard recently, like some of those experiences are, 4D in that they have like a scent component to them. And so then, wherever these are being housed, if there are other artworks, they have to think about like, what smells are we pumping into this gallery? Is the smell leaking out into other galleries? Like Pietro said, your nose is actually very, very sensitive. It's a very good sensor. So it doesn't take very much of these compounds escaping for you to notice them. So it's an interesting question as well, for those who want to put together these fully immersive experiences, how do you do that in a way that doesn't dampen or change the experience in other parts of the galleries or the museums that they're in?
I think it also that goes to this larger thing that over the course of the 20th century, particularly in the last 4 or 5 decades, artists have really aggressively pushed the space of materiality in terms of what artists work with in terms of materials. And now it can be literally anything from contracts and economic structures to language to scent. There's a lot of artists working specifically with scent now, as well as lots of other things. So I think it's just another way that you can look to the arena of activity that we call art as a mode of sensing and responding to an increasingly materially complex and technologically complex world by taking on all those things that are part of the non-art world and refunneling them through an expressive creative mode.
I mean, I think that's so well put, is that complexity, that the hyper object that cannot be seen but can be its symptoms might be experienced. And so like in this world where we're like so used to experiencing from the body that is like now gone through transformations that cannot be comprehended and have interconnected symptoms that seem completely improbable and unlikely, and our bodies start to sort of like fail ourselves or our abilities to comprehend anything at a global scale maybe is really interesting of the sort of the grappling with this, the sense of loss, or the sense of the world has become too small, or the sense of like, I don't know where I fit and I don't know what is happening. I think like a lot of the polarization in the world right now is also about that sense of fear.
And like the power of like a tool like science resides in its rigor and its ability to like zero in and eliminate variables and test on like this very meticulous kind of way and not go all over the place. That's what makes it work. That's what allows it to give us all the things that science gives us. But what it can't do is exactly that. It's not adroit at talking about lots of different things that are entangled at the same time. It would fail if it tried to do that. So that's
Wait, because I think there is a different layer to that. Because I think.
Sorry, I'm not a scientist, so I don't
No,
know.
no, this is very interesting. But like, because is it just complexity, or is just like something that transcends the variables that we work with? Because I know science. So there's stuff that we cannot answer in science, but it's just because we don't have enough scientific power to look at enough variables simultaneously. But at some point, technically, you can scale up and do it. Or is there something like that transcend these variables that is not even in a world that we can? That's the question.
I mean, yeah, I like that. I get your question. I like obviously science can wade into complexity, and there's lots of sciences that can take on extremely complex complexity. And so, maybe it's a semantic difference of like, is there a degree of complexity that escapes capture except by like the intuitive faculty? Maybe at some point those two things would be distinguishable from each other. But I to your point, I think you're right. But there is something in the expressive faculty that has the ability to kind of get at something ineffable.
I mean, but that's a question.
I'm wary of that word.
This makes me think, I'm going to come to the defense of light for a second. This sort of, I think, makes clear why light was so important and took the central role. And now we're trying to kind of claw back and say, look at all these other important things. But you never ask where that light is coming from, like where that sound is coming from, or what is that smell, or what is that color, or like, I feel something, I'm not sure what it is, right? There's a cleanness that is very useful for certain things in light, and why we latched onto it is such an informative and like precise tool to get at things. So I just want to say, go light. Just not, let's not forget the rest, but go light.
I have no problem.
I kind of wanted to like take a step back and do another tangent kind of thing, because a lot of this is like we keep going back and forth with the idea of like how things were maybe perceived differently, or like what we carry over through time and how that affects how like people will either in the future think of things, or like the perfume idea or anything like that. And like I think another aspect is just realizing that like we're all human, and like communication is like a funny thing. So I feel like I read this article, and I'm gonna get the location wrong and I feel bad, but I think it was either Greece or Rome, but they were trying to scientifically figure out how they made these sort of bricks that were sand-based, and they found this old writing that was like, here's the basic ingredients. It was like this part water, this part sand, and they kept trying to make it and it kept failing. And then it was only somewhat recently that they figured out you actually need salt water, but they didn't say that. They just said water. But it makes sense because back then, water to them was the ocean. So why would you say salt water if, like, when you talked to everybody, when you said water, everyone knew what you were talking about? So I just find that funny because it's like, even nowadays with how much technology we have and how much insight we have of the past and everything, I feel like as humans, we can always get caught up in that thing where it's like, nowadays we say a thing that everybody knows today, like, oh, salt water means salt water or ocean water or whatever. And then it's like, however many years in the future, like no one's gonna know what that means. Or like even where we say like a baking recipe where we're like, takes 2 eggs, and it's like, well, is it 2 like ostrich eggs? Is it 2 chicken eggs? But it's like in the future, who knows if we have chickens or like what that looks like what someone might think an egg is in the future. So like just coming back to that topic of like communication and how that intersects with like, you can look at a molecule and it means like, it's always going to mean that, but like scent might change over time versus like something decaying and it changes molecularly or anything like that. So
context. But yeah. So going against light, I was thinking of so light technically only has like, so you have 3 variables for like the space, and then would you have like 400 wavelengths that you can see, but like that's it. Like with like smell, like you have like proteins that can form like, I don't know, billions of shapes. So,
Right, it's simple.
I don't think
It's got polarization.
But it goes back.
Polarization.
We cannot see it.
You know, well, we don't necessarily see that, but lots of things do. And then a temporal component, temporal resolution.
Okay, one more dimension.
I agree that olfaction or chemical sensing is more dimensional, but it's not necessarily more information rich.
Yeah.
I wanted to argue with you about this earlier because of the bit rate at which you can acquire information about the world around you.
But that's the quantity of data, not quality.
It is quantity, yeah.
So
okay,
I don't know.
But the whole quantity versus
thing, right? I mean, that's the thing. The quality of information you get from light can be extremely rich, right? I could tell you how far away that exit sign is. I could discriminate that color from extremely.
But I think
fine
that's all in your
shades.
brain. It's not the sense. It's all your brain. You
That's a
invented
weird
that.
distinction, sorry, but
I mean, because you
my
invent.
system understanding that, it's like the entire system understanding smell.
But we make it up.
It's like the idea that it makes it almost like sight is disembodied, right? Like it's less embodied than other senses. But I mean, anyone who has had, for example, a migraine can describe a very like intrusive experience of light and of sight that doesn't seem just sort of, cognitive.
that's also
But that's
like the
there's
whole.
a reason, right? Like, so our words for theory and speculation, those are all ocular metaphors, one from Greek, one from Latin. They're about understanding through vision. And because despite being embodied, there is some kind of precision but richness that we get through sight that is just more complicated in other cases. And certain problems don't arise, other problems arise, but certain problems like the ones we've discussed today don't arise, and that's been useful for certain things.
Humans are definitely visual dominant animals. That's for sure.
I was gonna say you equated it to like quality versus quantity, but like quantity got us pretty far. Like quality is a new thing relative in like the timeline of humanity.
No, and to your point, actually, in favor of your point. No, I mean, there is also to be said about a multisensory experience, right? If we just look at visual experience and we only get so far. But if we add other senses to this at the same time, we get a far richer and not just the sum of the pieces kind of experience.
Right, but if you took away the vision and left those other things in place, you get a much less precise.
Actually, you would be surprised how blind people would
I know,
not agree.
I mean, Proust wrote a whole book about that. So smell obviously is an important thing. It's our most fundamental sense. I think someone said that already. But even evolutionarily, that's the most fundamental sense.
Vision? Smell. Which one now?
I guess touch is the most.
Mechanical
so too.
sensation
Yes,
is
I would also
the
agree.
earliest and most primitive sense.
Yeah.
So
And that's where hearing comes from too, so
Yeah.
that's got deep roots.
this topic made me, are we getting kicked out? No, okay. Made me, almost, yeah. Made me think about something that I read from, that it's as long back, and I'm gonna get it all wrong for the harder science people, but the idea was, it's sort of some of what we're learning about sensing from a biological standpoint maps a little bit onto Aristotelian thought, in the sense that the attention is focused away from the body with sight, whereas toward the body with touch and some of the baser senses of smell and taste. And I just wanted to throw
So
that out
early
there.
theories of light had light coming out of the
Yes.
eye. Perception was an active
Right.
It was
process.
ramen.
Yeah, so there's, it's ramen, okay.
Yeah, there's actually, this percept of actually, like, sight actually imparting force in the world. It's like eye lasers, all this crazy psychological stuff that suggests that people feel like they're actually applying pressure to things that they look at.
I mean, like, so
Right.
So-
Avert your eye, not to embarrass them.
light does apply pressure. Like you can, like, if I shine, so that there, like, one example is like a optical trap.
Yeah.
If I shine light on something that focuses it, because like you have an electric field that is changing, you have photons that are changing directions. Like you have a sphere, a photon comes here, bounces and goes in this direction. Like since you have like momentum going this way, you can block an object in the middle. And there is also, like, I think it's called light pressure. Like if you have a sensitive enough sensor, you can feel the pressure of photons, the momentum of the photons.
Yeah.
So it does exist. I don't know if you're sensitive enough to do it.
And things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then that's more heating.
Oh, it's
Heating.
like a differential.
Yeah. Heat. Yeah. I think.
Heat is like the.
Yeah.
I thought it was a solar wind. Isn't that a solar wind or something?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think.
That would be like.
Yeah, it's light. But I think like, but if you transduce like light, you absorb it, and then like the photons become phonons or stuff that bounce on each other.
Yeah.
And when they bounce on each other, they heat up, and then become something else, I guess. Yeah. When it's pure like the momentum of a photon is not absorbed, it just like transmit through something. So it doesn't change itself. It just like it just moves and it changes the way it moves, and like that's pure momentum of the photon that changes. I think.
We're in the weeds now.
But talking about like your initial question for the curators and conservators, like I was thinking like Caravaggio. I can barely see Caravaggio like now in a museum. How did they do it when he was painted? Or was it like, how did they see it? It was super dark. Where was it?
The sun makes brighter light than our cans in the museum. So, no, but I think it's interesting to think about chiaroscuro paintings in relation to the context where we started this conversation of, how that would be experienced in a candlelit church.
Or the Francese church in Rome, where the Caravaggios, he has the window right there where it shows where it's supposed to be.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean the perfect example of a site-specific painting.
And position there for the light.
Yeah.
To view it.
But it's,
I mean,
like some Matthew when the light in the painting or the light
the light in the painting.
the window in the painting.
It matches where the window is in the
Oh,
little
really?
chapel.
Yes.
Yeah,
I
you
didn't
have
realize
never
that.
been to that church? You
No,
should-
I've been, but I didn't realize
it's
that.
spectacular.
Oh.
Yeah.
I was at the wrong time, I guess.
Yeah.
You must remember. Yeah. I didn't know. That's cool.
Are we winding down?
I think so. Any parting remarks from
I
our
don't know that
excellent
no one has
moderator?
mentioned AI until now. Even though in 10 years, all parties will be done by AI.
No.
Is there gonna be art?
Is to say something about it.
NFTs, is it?
Well, NFT is.
Well, I mean, AI is not necessarily art. It's
It's just
artificial. I mean, it's
regurgitation of
We can-
existing
we
art.
can do another whole
It's not unique. It's not new art.
it's so much more. It's going to put all the professors out of business, right? Yeah.
Well, we hope that it remains a tool. It might not remain a tool. I mean, I'm really serious.
No, I'd rather, I mean, NFTs, I think, are more of a boondoggle, so.
No, yeah, NFTs are nothing. They're just.
They're just trading cards.
Yeah.
As long as I don't have to conserve them, we're fine.
Self-conserving.
Yeah.
I think with that, we should thank all of our discussants and thank all the audience members for our conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for bringing us together. This is
Yeah,
great.
super nice
Really
being here.
great.
Nice to meet
Thank
so many people.
Yep.
Okay.